All right, jumping right in today. We're taking a deep dive into a conversation about banking and power in America. You know, the kind of stuff they don't always teach you in school. We've got excerpts from a discussion with this guy. They call him the Iman.
Interesting.
Yeah, and he had some really intriguing takes on history, especially when it comes to the forces that shaped the United States.
I'm intrigued. What kind of stuff are we talking about here?
Well, they spend a good chunk of time talking about the Virginia Company, the one behind those first English
Right.
settlements.
Jamestown and all that?
Exactly. But they seem to suggest it wasn't all as straightforward as our history books might have us believe.
Oh, I like where this is going.
Uh-huh.
So what's their take? What's the hidden story behind the Virginia Company?
They suggest it wasn't just about, establishing colonies and all that, but rather a way for European powers to maintain a grip on resources and even, get this, ideology in the New World.
Interesting. So they saw it as more of a tool for control then, rather than just exploration and expansion.
Exactly.
Makes you think twice about those early days, doesn't it?
It really does. And what's even more interesting is how they connect this threat of control through various major historical events. We're talking about the American Revolution, even the Civil War, all potentially tied back to this centuries-old struggle for power and influence.
Wow, that's a bold claim. So how do they back that up? What's the evidence?
Well, this is where it gets really wild. They start talking about this thing called the independent sub-treasury.
The what?
The independent sub-treasury.
Yeah.
It was this period when the U.S. government actually managed its own finances, dealing primarily in gold and silver. Can you believe that?
Wow, I've never even heard of that. So what was that all about?
From what I gathered, it almost sounds like this idyllic period of financial stability. Like, imagine a time when the government wasn't beholden to private banks.
That's quite a concept.
Yeah.
So tell me more about this independent sub-treasury. How did it actually work?
Well, I'm going to need your expert help to unpack this one because honestly, it went a little over my head. But from what I understand, it was a direct response to the perceived dangers of an unregulated banking
Oh,
system.
okay. That makes sense. Back then, banks were basically issuing their own currencies, which, as you can imagine, caused a lot of chaos.
Like the Wild West of finance.
Pretty much. So the idea behind the independent sub-treasury was to create a system where the government, not private banks, controlled the money supply. A radical departure from the norm, wouldn't you say?
For sure. And according to this Iman fellow, it posed a direct threat to the established financial powers, both here and abroad.
That's interesting. So if it was such a good thing, what happened? Why did it disappear?
Well, that's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It seems like there's always more to the story.
Always. And according to the Iman, the independent sub-treasury was systematically dismantled because it challenged the status quo. They suggest that its demise paved the way for, you guessed it, the Federal Reserve System in 1913.
Yeah, the Fed, always a topic of debate.
To say the least.
So they see a direct line from the dismantling of the independent sub-treasury to the creation of the Federal Reserve.
That's how they're painting it, yeah.
Fascinating.
Mm-hmm.
But let's go back to the sub-treasury for a second. Paint me a picture. How did it actually work in practice?
Okay, so imagine you're a farmer back in, say, the 1840s, and you need to borrow money to buy seeds for the next planting season.
Okay, got it. I'm with you.
Before the independent sub-treasury, your only option would be to go to a private bank. These banks could charge whatever interest rates they wanted. And to make matters worse, they often issued their own banknotes.
Which weren't always accepted as payment elsewhere, I imagine.
Exactly. Can you imagine the headache?
A logistical nightmare. So how did this sub-treasury change things?
Well, under the sub-treasury system, the government would hold the money itself, backed by actual gold and silver, and they would issue standardized currency.
Got it. So it's all about stability and transparency. Sounds pretty good to me.
Right. It's all about putting the power back in the hands of the people, or at least the government that's supposed to represent them.
That's a key point, isn't it? Who controls the money?
Exactly.
And who gets to decide how it's created and circulated? Big questions.
Huge. And speaking of powerful players, they bring up this group called the Knights of the Golden Circle. Ever heard of them?
Knights of the Golden Circle. Vaguely. It rings a bell, but I couldn't tell you exactly who they were.
Yeah, they don't exactly teach you about these guys in school. Basically, they were this secretive organization in the mid-19th century.
Okay, secretive how? Like, were we talking secret handshakes and passwords?
You know it. They had secret rituals, passwords, the whole 9 yards. But what's important here is their alleged goal to establish a golden circle of territories encompassing the southern U.S. and parts of Central America, all united under, get this, a pro-slavery, economically independent empire.
Wow. Talk about a different vision for America. So they were like the ultimate pre-Civil War secessionists then.
Exactly. And while their exact role in actually starting the Civil War is still up for debate, the Iman uses them as an example of the brewing tensions and alternative visions for America's future.
So they represent this pushback against the direction the country was heading in, at least in their eyes.
Exactly. And they saw the rise of industrial capitalism in the North as a threat to their way of life.
Their economic interests, too, I imagine.
Absolutely. And this is where they connect it back to the conversation about the independent subtreasury. It's almost like they see the dismantling of that system as a victory for these pro-capitalist forces, potentially even pro-European interests.
It's like they're saying that the Civil War wasn't just about slavery or states' rights, but about control over the nation's financial future.
Right. Who gets to call the shots when it comes to money?
Exactly. And they seem to be suggesting that the victors were those who wanted to centralize financial power and move away from this idea of sound money.
Which brings us back to the dismantling of the independent subtreasury. It's like that was the final nail in the coffin for this vision of a decentralized, more democratically controlled financial system.
So they're painting a picture of a lost opportunity, a different path that America could have taken.
Right. It makes you wonder, what would America look like today if the independent subtreasury had survived?
A very different place, I'd imagine.
Right. Would we even have the Federal Reserve as we know it today? Would our relationship with money be completely different?
It's definitely something to think about. But let's not forget, they're not just throwing out historical anecdotes here. They're weaving in some pretty compelling evidence to support their claims. For example, they cite speeches and writings from President Lincoln himself.
Oh, really? Like what?
Well, Lincoln expressed deep concern about the growing influence of these powerful financial interests. He even went so far as to suggest that they posed a greater threat to the nation than the Confederacy itself.
There's that quote of his, right? Something about a crisis approaching that unnerves him and makes him tremble for the safety of the country.
Exactly. He talks about corporations being enthroned and an era of corruption following.
Chilling stuff. But it does make you wonder, if Lincoln was so wary of these forces, why was the independent subtreasury ultimately dismantled during his presidency?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
And this is where the conversation takes a bit of a turn. It gets kind of conspiratorial.
Oh, I love a good conspiracy. Lay it on me.
Well, they bring up the assassination of Lincoln,
Okay.
and they seem to suggest that it might have been more than just the act of a lone gunman.
You're saying John Wilkes Booth, not so solo after all.
That's the vibe they're giving off, yeah. They imply that Lincoln's opposition to these powerful financial interests might have made him a target.
Wow, so we're talking about a full-blown conspiracy to take down a sitting president.
It's definitely a bold claim. But let's say, for argument's sake, that there's something to this idea. What was the ultimate goal, according to them? Why go through all that trouble?
Yeah, what's the end game here?
Control.
Control, huh?
That's what it always comes down to, doesn't it?
I guess so.
The Iban argues that these individuals, these institutions, they weren't necessarily driven by malice or greed,
Yeah.
but by this deep-seated belief that they knew what was best for the world.
So they were the good guys in their own minds.
Exactly. They saw themselves as architects of a new global order, one built on the principles of, free trade, industrial capitalism, centralized control.
And anyone who stood in their way, well, let's just say they wouldn't be missed too much.
That's a pretty dark way to put it, but yeah, I think you're catching on.
It's a scary thought, honestly, but it's hard to ignore the parallels to what we see happening in the world today.
That's their point. They're not just talking about dusty old history books here. They're arguing that this same mindset, this lust for control, it persists today, just in more subtle and sophisticated forms.
So the more things change, the more they stay the same.
That's one way to look at it. They argue that the same forces that wanted to dismantle the independent subtreasury back in the 19th century, they're still around today, shaping our world through institutions like the World Bank, the International Monetary Fund,
Even the Federal Reserve.
especially the Federal Reserve.
So it's not just about understanding the past, it's about understanding the forces that shape our lives today.
Precisely. And one of the recurring themes in this conversation is how these forces operate. Often in the shadows, using things like financial manipulation, propaganda, even carefully orchestrated conflicts to achieve their goals.
It all sounds very cloak and dagger.
Oh, it gets better. They're particularly interested in this one incident called the Trent Affair.
The Trent Affair. Sounds vaguely familiar, but refresh my memory.
So, picture this. It's the middle of the Civil War. You've got the Confederacy trying to secure support from Europe, especially England and France.
Okay. Makes sense. They needed all the help they could get.
Right, so they send this guy, John Slidell, as a sort of Confederate ambassador.
High stakes diplomacy.
Tell me about it. But the Union, they knew about this mission. And they intercepted the British ship Slidell was traveling on, captured him and his companions,
Oh boy, that must have ruffled some feathers.
to say the least. England threatened to go to war with the U.S. if Slidell wasn't released.
Wow, talk about an international incident. But how does this all tie back to, the bigger picture of financial control and hidden forces?
Well, the Imans suggests that this whole Trent affair, it might have been orchestrated or at least exploited by those who wanted to see the U.S. weakened by a long, drawn-out conflict.
We can have.
Think about it. A war between the U.S. and England. That would have been a huge boon to those who were already profiting from the Civil War, those who wanted to maintain their grip on global finance and trade.
So it's like they were trying to fan the flames of conflict, hoping it would spread and create more chaos and instability.
Exactly. And while it's impossible to say for sure what was going on behind closed doors, it does raise some interesting questions about who ultimately benefits from these kinds of conflicts.
That's for sure. Weakened how? I mean, I get that war is bad for everyone, but were they really trying to profit off of it?
Think about it. A war between the U.S. and England, that would have been huge, right?
Oh, yeah, massive.
And who benefits when a country is distracted, maybe even falling apart?
They're enemies. They're rivals.
Exactly. The ones who can swoop in and grab more power, more control.
So those who are already pulling the strings behind the scenes of the Civil War.
You got it. And don't forget about the financial side of things. Wars are expensive, right? Countries need loans. They need resources. Who's there to provide them?
The bankers.
Bingo. So you can see how a prolonged conflict, especially one involving major powers like the U.S. and England, well, that would have been a pretty sweet deal for those who knew how to play the game, wouldn't it?
A pretty cynical game, I'd say.
No doubt about it. But that's what the Iman's trying to highlight here. This idea that there are always winners and losers in these situations. And sometimes the winners aren't the ones you'd expect.
It's definitely a lot to wrap my head around. It makes you wonder how much of history is actually just, the official story, and how much of it is shaped by these hidden agendas and power plays.
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Hmm.
And I don't think there's an easy answer. But the fact that we're even asking these questions, that we're digging deeper and challenging the narratives we've been taught, well, that's a good thing. That's how we start to see things more clearly.
One thing that really struck me about this whole conversation is how relevant it feels to what's happening in the world today.
Right? It's like history repeating itself, just with different actors and a slightly updated script.
Exactly. So where do we go from here? I mean, if these forces have been operating for centuries, shaping the world to their liking, what can we as individuals even do about it?
That's the question, isn't it? What can any of us do in the face of these seemingly insurmountable systems of power?
It feels kind of overwhelming, to be honest.
I hear you, but here's the thing. The first step is awareness, right?
Awareness. Okay. I'm listening.
The more we understand how these systems operate, how they manipulate information, how they use fear and division to maintain control, the better equipped we are to see through their games and make more informed choices.
So it's about becoming more critical thinkers, more skeptical of the narratives we're being fed?
Exactly. Question everything.
Question everything. I like it.
Don't just accept things at face value. Do your own research. Listen to diverse perspectives. And most importantly, trust your gut.
Your gut.
Yeah, that feeling you get when something doesn't sit right, when a narrative feels incomplete, when you sense there's more to the story than what you're being told.
Don't ignore that feeling.
Ever ignore it.
Yeah.
That's your inner BS detector going off, and it's usually right.
So it's about becoming more conscious consumers of information, thinking for ourselves, and not letting others dictate what we believe.
That's it in a nutshell. And remember, knowledge is power, and the more we know about the forces that shape our world, the better equipped we are to navigate it effectively and create the kind of future we want to see.
A future where we're not just pawns in someone else's game.
Exactly. A future where we're active participants, informed citizens, and empowered individuals who can't be so easily manipulated.
Well said. This has been quite the deep dive. We've covered a lot of ground today, from the early days of the Virginia Company to the shadowy world of international intrigue to the ever-relevant question of who really controls the money. And while it's a lot to process, I think the most important takeaway is this. Keep asking questions, keep digging deeper, and never stop seeking the truth, even if it's hidden in plain sight. Until next time, keep exploring, keep learning, and most importantly, keep thinking for yourselves.